Thank you, David, for joining us for the Humans of AI podcast. I would love, first of all, to start with you just go ahead and introduce yourself, your current role, and then we'll take it from there.
Sounds good. Yes. I'm David Ryan Polgar. I am the founder and president of the nonprofit called All Tech is Human. At All Tech is Human, we come together to tackle tech and society's wickedest problems, right? Whether it's reducing CSAM, whether it's tackling mis and disinformation, hate speech online. We bring together people across society, government, industry, and academia to understand best practices, commonalities, and promote a culture of knowledge sharing and collaboration.
I was so excited to find this community, to find this organization as somebody who I work at a generative AI
Hmm.
company, and I am at the forefront of all of the fear around generative AI and the
Hot topic right now.
concerns that are legitimate concerns. And I, as somebody who's dedicated to human rights and ethics, I want to make sure that I'm doing the right thing
Definitely.
by even representing this company. So I was so excited to find this organization. And I imagine that there's a story behind how All Tech is Human
There
came into
is.
being.
Yeah.
So please talk to me about that
Sure.
first.
Yeah. I started All Tech is Human in 2018. My own background's as a attorney and educator. I got heavily involved in the space of how technology was really upending how we live, love, learn, even die, recognizing that the future of tech is intertwined with the future of the human condition and the future of democracy. And that is a big deal, full stop. Recognize that we're entering a new period kind of in human history where we need to have the artists and designers, the saints and the poets and the attorneys and the advocates and youth leaders and people who have lots of experience coming together really to understand these issues, to understand what a better tech future even looks like. But to your point, Laura, like my origin story about why, frankly, I even shifted my career. I used to live in West Hartford, Connecticut. Made the move recently to live full time in Manhattan, where our org is based. But we have a global audience, right? 88 countries, over 8,000 members on our Slack community, just for one example. And that's what's great about New York is it's a city based in the United States, but it's always global. I live right below the UN, and not a day goes by where you don't see this intersection of so many different groups coming together. It's really kind of fascinating to watch. But anyhow, yeah, I do have aspects of my life that caused me to want to really get involved in this. I got heavily involved in that space of digital well-being and tech ethics before that was really even much of a thing, right? There was always people like Sherry Turkle, or Dr. Greenfield, who I did some work with in Connecticut. He wrote the book Virtual Addiction, 1998, was talking about the dopamine connection far before the current conversations that are happening today. But really, what I always saw is that technology intersected with every aspect of life. And I really thought that it was a misnomer that technology is left solely to technologists. Obviously, that's an active role, but recognizing that we need to think about the laws, we need to think about the ethics, we need to think about human behavior. I'll give you an example. A lot of people currently are talking about the recent generative AI photo of Taylor Swift, of a non consensual image sharing, showcasing artificially that she was nude. What I always find fascinating is that technology is moving at such an accelerated pace, yet our ability to understand its social impacts, come together about norms of behavior, about legal aspects that we need to kind of set in motion, that's moving painfully slow. So everything that I've dedicated my life to and where I saw a huge need for all tech as human that frankly was not being solved, in my opinion, is we need a better approach that can move at the speed of tech. Everything comes down to the fact that the gulf between the speed of innovation and the slowness of our consideration, that delta is far too large. So, for example, with the Taylor Swift photo, what they're going to find, right? Her legal team's looking at this, but what they're going to find is, wait a minute, we have all these different laws out there. They haven't really caught up with this issue. It's not a copyright issue if it's fully kind of generative AI and not based on somebody's copyright or her own photo. You don't have the same conception anymore of how you consider a victim, which is typically how we think about a lot of law, especially in criminal law. How do you have this when it's artificial? But at the same time, it's very clear to people in that scenario, even though it was happening far before Taylor Swift. But it seems like when you have a big name like that, it gets people's attention, as it has. What we recognize is we're saying, wow, like this is really intriguing of what happened. We need to do something about this. And I always, since like I said, my background as an attorney, I always saw this firsthand. This was bubbling up years and years ago. I'll give you an example that led to me saying, wait a minute, I need to change my life. I need to move to Manhattan. I need to dedicate everything I do to bringing people together. And frankly, what we're doing is building a better mousetrap for how we can tackle complex tech and society issues. What we're doing is we're building the world's largest multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary network in responsible tech, and that allows us to tackle these hard problems moving at the speed of tech, leverage the collective intelligence of the community, and diversify the types of people involved in this process to better match the challenges we face. Anyhow, a bunch of years ago, before the rise of Instagram and TikTok, you had little MySpace, which was hot at the time. I remember a scenario, I believe it happened in Missouri, where really bizarre scenario, but it was a situation where you had two teenage girls that were kind of, close friends. They had some falling out that really upset the mother. So the mother created a fake account, befriended the other teen girl, saying that she was a boy around the same age. They created like an online relationship. This girl thought she was in a romantic relationship. And then the mother, masquerading as the teen boy, breaks up with the teen girl. The teen girl goes on to, unfortunately, commit suicide. What happened in that situation is they didn't know what to do. They didn't have a state law to go after her for, right? Because this was before a lot of the cyberbullying laws. So this is always the problem. Everybody looked at that case and they said, my God, this mother is a terrible person. But what we know about law is being a terrible person doesn't put you in jail. Breaking a law puts you in jail. And it's a major, major, major distinction. So what we're finding a lot with tech is things are happening that are clearly in our consensus unethical. But ethics doesn't always coincide perfectly with law. I always like to think of it as a bellwether. A lot of things that are going to be illegal in the future are currently unethical, but then it takes us a while to kind of catch up with that scenario. So luckily in that situation, they were able to, I believe, say that MySpace was California. And I think that they ended up applying a federal law that they were able to then go after this individual. But the point is, everything is out of whack. Everything is not lined up perfectly. And that's where I really saw my own strengths as an individual. Frankly, I've always leaned into being kind of a community builder. So even before like All Tech is Human in 2015, while still in Connecticut, I co-founded something called the Digital Citizenship Summit. The following year, we held a big event that had people flying in across the globe at Twitter headquarters when that was still Twitter headquarters. And then people started doing these gatherings for this, Digital Citizenship Summit. They started doing it in various places, various countries throughout the globe. So I always just saw that, I had a knack for knowing which way the wind is blowing, but also just this ability to bring together a diverse range of stakeholders, which is fairly unique.
Mm-hmm.
And we do that at All Tech is Human by creating a agnostic space that basically says you can disagree. And frankly, disagreement is good in American culture, right? We want that as long as it's respectful. Because at the same time, what you find is whether you have somebody who is at a startup or a major tech company, somebody who is a policymaker, a student, an artist, a designer, a researcher, an academic, they think they're so different, but we're all swimming in the same direction. We're all saying that
We all share similar
exactly,
values,
we share
right?
similar values,
Exactly.
that the status quo is not sustainable, that there needs to be a change. There needs to be a change. And what I always think is that everybody is upset at everyone else, right? There's a great Spider-Man meme where there's like three Spider-Man and they're all kind of pointing at each other,
Pointing at each
right?
other.
And that's the way I think of it right now, whereas you have industry that's pointing at one other direction, saying, well, okay, well, what's the role of parents? What's the role of students? How do we get guidance with the laws? And then you have the legislative branch that's pointing back at industry, and then you have civil society that's saying, wait a minute, why don't you leverage my kind of intelligence? And you have the general public that's saying, what the heck is happening here? We're always talking a big game, but nothing seems to change. I'm sitting here in New York, and it always seems like every time we travel, like we've held 2 events last year in London, and we'll be back there more times this year, and then also various places throughout Europe and other locations that are being discussed. And what we always find is there's a lot of frustration because you have different parts of the globe that are reacting at a different pace. So you have the UK and EU that seems to be a lot more potentially forward thinking around tech policy. But then the power structure is still largely dependent on the United States for where the tech is kind of coming from. And so there's a lot of frustration. So we'll see what happens in that scenario. And then just quickly to fully kind of get into the origin story, I saw in so many different ways how technology was completely upending our lives in a dramatic scenario, right? I remember even just this one situation, right, which really caused me to say, you know what, this is maybe my life's calling. This was before Facebook was mobile. That was a time that did exist. And that was a time where, friend requests would not be as immediate, not just be like a quick accept, right? You kind of like go on and okay. And that was when, like early on, like everybody from high school who you knew in college and wherever started befriending each other on Facebook. And there was this one scenario where this individual, Jared, sent me a friend request, and it hung there just for like a couple days, and I'm going to accept it. But then I heard from my good friend Tracy from high school, and she said, David, had you heard the news? Jared unfortunately committed suicide. And it was a situation like that that really brought everything into focus, just how significant this issue is, because at the same time, that friend request didn't go away. It stayed there, right?
Mm-hmm.
It stayed there as if this individual was living and breathing and could converse with me. So my larger point there is it was pivotal moments like that in my life that caused me to say, my God, everybody who is getting into startups, everyone who is on the cover of Fast Company and Inc. and Wired, we've had major change, right, of how we thought even about tech leaders. But everyone at that time, it was still in the rah-rah, social media is going to lead to the spreading of democracy and the elevation of human intelligence. Well, how has that turned out? Authoritarianism is on the rise, and lots of people believe the earth is flat. Spoiler alert, it is not, it's quite round. And the point there is that technologists, in my opinion, have a bias towards thinking it's a set it and forget it. To quote
Mm-hmm.
the famous Ron Popeil of infomercial glory, the late, great Ron Popeil. But technology is not a set it and forget it scenario. Just because you put the world's information, all the world's knowledge at our fingertips, right? That was the original idea. Like, that's my backstory. Like, when I was in high school, it was this time of optimism, where a term they don't use anymore, but they call it the information superhighway. And the concept was, and I think that was largely Bill Gates at the time pushing it. The idea was, it doesn't matter if you're in Timbuktu or Kathmandu. You don't have to be at Harvard. You can have all the world's intelligence at your fingertips. That's the web. That's the power of the world. And also, it doesn't matter if I'm sitting in Kenosha, Wisconsin, or Berkeley, California. I can connect with everyone and recognize that they might speak a different language. They might come from a different background. They might be thousands of miles away, but you recognize that we're all human, right? So the very optimistic ethos of the early web was that we would tear down barriers. There would be this global village, and we would see that we can all kind of come together. That's the idea, right? Really, just this.
That's the
That's the
promise.
promise. That's the
Absolutely.
promise.
I would love to shift our
Please.
focus,
Yeah.
because that is that
Yes.
promise.
Yeah.
And we're obviously, everybody is experiencing the aftermath of when a promise feels broken, right? And now we have this opportunity with this new generative AI technology,
Yes.
that we can say, hey, what have we learned from opening up the world's information and opening up connectivity to everyone? What have we learned, and how can we put parameters, put guardrails around this technology? So talk to me about that. You
Yes.
mentioned, when we went into, talking about going on to the podcast, that you wanted to talk about this idea of scaling intimacy.
Definitely. Yes.
And I would love to talk about it through a lens of how generative AI has shifted that ability to scale intimacy,
Sure.
not only just interpersonally, but also at a business scale, right?
So right now, every business utilizes LinkedIn. That's the platform where I spend the most time. I spend a strange amount of time thinking about the inner workings of LinkedIn, because it's dramatically helped the growth of All Tech is Human. We launched our first Responsible Tech Summit in the fall of 2018 in New York because I pushed it out on LinkedIn. I said, hey, crazy idea, this shoestring budget. Anybody want to come together and talk about these larger issues? And we had people jumping on planes from Europe to do it. So recognize the power there. But what you see on LinkedIn is this increasing leaning into generative AI to spark additional communication. The issues that come up with this, though, is really trying to actually say, well, what is a relationship? There's a famous term like the Dunbar number, named after the British anthropologist Robin Dunbar, who kind of studied a lot of different relationships and kind of came up with saying, hey, the average person can handle around 150 relationships, meaning that about 150 people is the max where you can kind of know who they are, know a little bit about their background, their family, and what they're up to. The reason why that is important is a significant portion of our lives. Most people who are in business, it's really about relationships. Everything All Tech is Human does is about relationships. We've had hundreds of people who have graced our stages, a lot of major names, and that has happened because we have cultivated strong relationships. So I always think about, how do you build relationships? And the issue that's going to be more pronounced in the coming years with generative AI is you always have people who only think of numbers. Here's the thing, people are not numbers. And that's a major, major part to underline there. So with generative AI, it can be extremely helpful for helping an individual, let's say for LinkedIn, to craft a message or to be kind of like a writer's prompt. The concern that I have is that people start replacing thought with thoughtless communication. And we've always heard, right, every time you celebrate a birthday with somebody or Christmas or something like that, we always like to say it's the thought that counts. And we take that statement for granted, but really what that means to me is that relationships are based on reciprocity, right? Relationships are based on saying, wow, you took 10 minutes out of your day. You thought about me and what I was up to, and you're curious how I was doing and what was on the agenda, for the future. You wanted to check in with me. And because you gave 10 minutes of your time, the idea is that I will also give approximately 10 minutes of my time. People who try to scale intimacy and lean into generative AI to the point where they're trying to just play a numbers game, that really, in my opinion, backfires because on one hand, they're communicating with more people, but the aggregate of relationship value, I would argue, is much lower because they're effectively just spamming people. You know what people don't like? Some people like the actual spam, especially in Hawaii, but people don't like to be spammed. So there's literally no point to ever just send somebody an automated type of message. Give you an example. Last couple of years, LinkedIn has really leaned into, the congrats on the work anniversary types of posts. What I find intriguing about that is sometimes I even play around with how people react to it just for my own kind of curiosity. And I remember this one situation where this individual, right? And again, I'm way over the Dunbar number. I didn't even know I'm connected with thousands of people, right, on LinkedIn. I obviously don't have thousands of friends. I have a lot of friends, a lot of people I know. But we're all faced with this struggle, which is why we lean into tools like generative AI. We have to, be more efficient. So generative AI can be great for efficiency of how we communicate, but we always want to make sure we don't lose sight of why we are communicating. Anyhow, this one individual, 3 times in a row, I just saw like a message history. Congrats on the work anniversary. Congrats on the work anniversary. And I'm always thinking like, well, one, LinkedIn, it can be annoying because they put work anniversaries for little things you don't even really think of as like a work anniversary, right? For lots of other affiliations a person might have, like myself. So I always thought, my God, like, what is this person trying to do? They're not just writing me. They're just, congrats on the work anniversary. Okay, congrats on the work anniversary. So then I followed up after 3 and I said, hey, how's everything going? I see that you're doing X, Y, and Z. And, by just clicking on their profile. And no response. So I'm thinking, here you have a person who kind of like if you saw the show Lost, they're just punching numbers into a machine. They don't know why they're punching it. And maybe it doesn't even matter, right? So that's how I view those types of individuals. There's also a classic short story by Ray Bradbury called Marionettes that I think is illustrative of where we're headed with generative AI and why we need to be a little mindful. The short story, and then it was made into kind of like a short film adaptation that you can watch. What it deals with is it's this individual, it's talking about in the future, there's a time period where you can buy a marionette of yourself, buy a duplicate of yourself who acts like you, who talks like you. This is a lot of where people are leaning into utilizing generative AI. They're basically saying, well, wait a minute, can't we just create your doppelganger? Can't they just communicate? Why? Like they would say, well, David, like you obviously can't know thousands of people and communicate with them, but we could learn your writing style. And then when they email you, then you could email them back. They wouldn't know it's not you. And on one hand, you're thinking, wow, that would save me some time. But then on the flip side, what does that actually say about the relationship? That person thinks, hey, David cares about me, but really I don't even know that I really communicated with them. So I provided no thought, and they think that I provided thought, which in itself throws off the idea of reciprocity of how you even think about relationships. But here it ties in with Marionettes by Ray Bradbury because he was getting in this story, a little bit dark kind of comedy, say, my God, my wife, she's asking me all these questions. I just want to do other things. I just want to golf or something like that. So he creates, he buys one of these humanoids that, is supposed to just talk to his wife, and then he can go out and do his own thing. Well, the punchline of the marionette's piece is that we find out that his own wife had already done that earlier. So you effectively have two marionettes talking to each other. And that is the potential path of thoughtless communication if we don't think about it. Because if I can be thoughtless and if I can automate everything, then can't the other side of the equation do that? Well, then what the heck are we communicating for if it's literally just bot to a bot? So that is a bizarro scenario that we are potentially heading towards. So my larger point is generative AI is something that is extremely helpful, especially to businesses, but we always have to maintain the focus on why are we building relationships and how do you build sticky relationships, and you build that through showing that you care and actually caring. So you can always be more efficient with that. I'm always trying to be more efficient with that. And generative AI is a help. But when people lean into it to the point that they think they can automate their life, they're in for a rude awakening, because really what they've become is a annoying spammer.
Yeah, I love that analogy with the two marionettes talking to each other, and any reference to Ray Bradbury gets two thumbs up from me. You talked briefly about how you find generative AI as a force multiplier for
Yes,
efficiency.
definitely.
Talk to me a little bit more about what are some good ways that you're finding to
Oh,
use generative
yes.
AI. It's kind of this interesting
Mm-hmm.
conundrum that I'm discovering as I'm talking to guests about the safety around generative
Mm-hmm.
AI. And at the same time, people are innovating using generative AI
Definitely.
to drive safety. So, how are you
Oh,
using generative
yes. Yeah.
AI?
In the nonprofit space, and I was just speaking at a conference about this, and I think some of the audience that was all just nonprofit kind of people, they took this to heart. When you're running a nonprofit, you have to apply to a lot of grants, and grants can be like a thesis where it's like kind of painful. Whereas sometimes you're saying, "My God, why do I have to answer this question, this detail?" So a lot of people are really leaning into generative AI to get out of their kind of writer's block, to give them a skeleton of understanding. Obviously, the danger is you want to make sure that it's unique and in your voice. But, we've always used tools to allow us to kind of move that along. And that's why I say, like, if you're a writer, like, start writing, write page one, because when you look at a blank page, that's scary, and that can be like an impetus. That can really be a roadblock. So I think that's the tricky part. So I've certainly kind of leaned into that aspect. I think some people are curious about the content moderation kind of side of it. There's so much communication that needs to happen. I'll give you an example. I mentioned our Slack community has grown to over 8,000 members across 88 countries. With that, you have so many kind of like frequently asked questions. And that's where I see the huge promise with generative AI, is that there's sometimes the need for that thoughtful communication, but a lot of communication is actually just, I need information. Where is this information? How do I understand this? So where I always see the promise, and this took a little while, because I remember like 10 years ago, there was a big boom, right, for like chatbots, but then there was kind of like an overpromise at the time. They weren't as efficient. It was more like if this, then that. So it didn't provide that level of like conversation that people wanted. But with generative AI now, there is that promise that a lot of times somebody might just say, like, what is all tech even? What upcoming gatherings do you have? What reports have you done? Like, there's a lot of that now, as opposed to just the old school kind of chatbots, kind of set you in more just like a, okay, go here, A or B. Now it's providing kind of more context behind it, which I think can be exciting. But then on the flip side, there's a lot of concern to make sure that the information is correct. And I think that's going to be one of the great struggles with generative AI. And there's specific examples on this. I remember I even wanted to kind of test it out on ChatGPT. Want to find out, is it giving us right information even about All Tech is Human? Turns out it's not always. I mean, pretty good description, which was great. But for some reason, I'm the sole founder of All Tech is Human, 2018. But for some reason, it lists another person as the founder. This is a person I do know. I've spoken at her events. She's attended some of ours and been on stage. But for some reason, it somehow got conflated into the system. Obviously, people talk about, hallucinations, which frankly, I would never use that term because that really kind of provides this insinuation that AI is a human, which it is not, right? It's taking that information, is putting it together, and it's spitting something out, right? It's not a living human person. So it's not hallucinating like an actual person can hallucinate. And I think that also puts the burden back on the individual to say, oh, geez, I guess it's just some crazy hallucination. I guess ChatGPT is having a bad day, as opposed to, well, that's something that OpenAI needs to fix.
Yeah, at Writer, our CEO calls those moments of large language model, basically it's just filling in the blanks because it doesn't have that information.
Right.
She calls it plausible bullshit. And I think that is a great way of describing it.
Yes, because those have been the biggest screw ups with generative AI, right? Like the court cases.
Yes, because I think people are assuming, oh, these are all knowing entities and they can pull information. And really, they're only as good as the training data that they're built on.
Yes.
They have this vast corpus of knowledge and even, a major computing process to get to fine-tuned moments like that, where it's just factual information, which is why we're at Writer working with a knowledge retrieval. It's called retrieval augmented generation, which is very about locating specific information that you've fed to the model within your organization. And that way it helps limit hallucinations and gets more accurate information into the hands of your stakeholders. So as you're building out your Slack community, you might have a RAG solution, or you've fed it your corpus of data. So that way it's there and it's not just pulling it from the random public common crawl that it was trained on.
And that's the problem, right? Because the random part, as opposed to feeding it into the corpus, might be kind of wrong information. So it's the kind of classic garbage in, garbage out kind of scenario. But you also mentioned, right, areas that I'm excited about. I am excited with generative AI around, obviously they have to make sure that the copyright issue is kind of squared away. There are lots of, suits with, comedians and other people right now to make sure that, something is original. It's not too based on the information, or even have like New York Times suing OpenAI. Where I see a lot of personal usage is even just around the image creation, if it can truly be unique. Because one of my own frustrations, even with growing All Tech is Human, is I've always thought, my God, like here's an idea of how I can see a visual in my head, right? If I'm writing this piece, or if we have some for the website, like I can imagine it in my head, but I can't make it. I can't create it. I can't do enough on Canva to make this happen. And that can be frustrating. So that's where I've really seen an explosion of creativity, where people have been able to say, like, here's my brain dump of what I'm imagining. And then sometimes you can come up with like Dali-esque looking kind of images. They're somewhat trippy, but also incredibly creative.
We are admittedly over time, so I want to make sure that we get a chance to cover anything that you wanted to discuss in this chat.
Sure. Since we're talking about generative AI, I think this is like a key part of like, how do we bring together these different stakeholders for it? Because this is a scenario with like lawsuits that are going on, with how people are kind of using it, with just how people change around how they're even thinking about generative AI in education. Right before it was like, don't use this. And now it's like, let's all use this. So I think maybe that's for 2 minutes discuss, like, how do we bring people together?
That's a big through line that we saw as we were researching you, is this idea of having a collaborative, multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary approach.
That's my vibe. That's my vibe.
What are you doing? Yeah. Talk to us about what you're doing at All Tech is Human, specifically around AI?
Mhm.
Who's coming together around that? I've been very excited. I've already found some future guests on this podcast through the Responsible AI Slack channel.
I love it.
So talk to me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so even right now, we're doing kind of like a AI virtual hackathon around kind of AI governance. We had a great gathering a few months ago with Raman Chowdhury, who does amazing work. We had Dr. Joy from Algorithmic Justice League, also Meredith Broussard. So we get a lot of the great kind of leaders with responsible AI. And where we're going with this is leaning into the idea that in order to solve these wicked tech and society issues, and generative AI is a case in point where it has significant promise and significant peril. So we're trying to co-create the best course of action that kind of maximizes that positive aspects of it. But in order for that to happen, we need to bring together all these different stakeholders. So in the coming months for All Tech is Human, we've got multiple gatherings around responsible AI and then specifically looking into generative AI. We're doing projects around reducing some of the kind of non-consensual image sharing that happens with generative AI. We're thinking about it from a legal kind of standpoint, right? How do we get over this natural tension that's always happened with the web, is that the web wants everything to be free, but we've always had to balance that out with creativity. Even when you think about copyright law, it's based on this idea that we need to incentivize and maximize creativity. And that's like a little bit of a Goldilocks zone, because you need to offer protection for creators to promote enough incentive that they become creative and that they have this as their livelihood. Whereas at the same time, the web really is a great use case for remix culture. And that's why you have certain people who might think of copyleft movement as opposed to the copyright. You have groups like Creative Commons that are kind of, my opinion, kind of better aligned with how the web even works. So we're doing a lot with that responsible AI kind of aspect at All Tech is Human. So I think anybody kind of listening for this conversation, if you want to get involved, that's the difference, I think, with All Tech is Human, is that we don't just have this one-way communication. We're not just like a few thought leaders who are pushing up this idea and then you sneeze it to other people. It's more about saying you're all part of the process, right? So no matter what your livelihood is or your perspective is, you have something to offer. Like, your lived experience is crucial, because we need to create a tech future when we think about generative AI that's aligned with our values. Therefore, it behooves us to have a diverse range of stakeholders and public participation happen in this. So anybody who's looking to kind of participate, I'd love to have them get involved right at alltechshuman.org, join our Slack community, attend our summits or mixers if you're far away from where this happen. We have live streams, we have open working groups, job board, town pool, so much. So love to have
It
everyone
is a
get involved.
phenomenal. It's so impressive
Thank you.
what you've created, and thank you very much for spearheading it. Just to bring our conversation full circle, we talked about kind of the broken promise
Yes.
of connectivity and accessibility, but I think that this is the type of movement that could not be possible without
Oh,
all of that
right.
connectivity and accessibility. And that's exciting, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's always going to be this interesting infinite loop, right? Of, we've created this amazing thing and now we have to rein it in,
Me
and it's
too.
up to us, the people that are the users. It's not going to be some faceless entity of tech
Mm-hmm.
giant leaders. It's going to be the people, the democracy
Yes.
of the web, of online, driving how we use this responsibly.
And that's where the name All Tech is Human even comes from, because I strongly disagree with people who think that technology is on this endless march forward. It zigs and it zags, right? If I listen to every futurist, well, I would own an NFT. I do not. We'd be using Bitcoin. We do not. We'd be in the metaverse that is flopping, right? We'd be using segways. Well, maybe if you're at a mall. So people have a really, really hard time predicting the future. And the reason, in my opinion, is because we are what determines the future. It's what we do today or don't do today. It's how we come together. It's how we create laws. It's how we think about this. It's how we collaborate. It's the products that we build, the gatherings that we have, right? Like that's how the future happens. It's about our involvement and it's about human agency. So all tech is human, and it doesn't matter whether we use terms like hallucination. At the end of the day, it's run by our ideas and our agency and the society that they all operate within.
Thank you so much for having this conversation with me. Again, I'm so excited about your community. I can't wait to participate more in it and also let other people know about it.
I
And so
really
we can
appreciate
bring
being
more
on.
like-minded folks in and help create a movement of responsibility and safety
Let's keep
as
on
we
growing.